The U.S. insisted that public safety in Afghanistan should be a responsibility for the Afghans, despite the fact that at this point the country had no army and no police force.
The U.S. Defense Secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, said it would be a fool's errand to get more involved in a tribal society as complex as Afghanistan.
Rumsfeld said U.S. forces would use their influence to prevent outright fighting, but that nobody would do peacekeeping or public security outside Kabul.
Get that in Colchester, would you?
Britain led the first group of international forces to assist with the security of Kabul. That left 80% of the country, more than twice the size of the UK, unsecured.
Who did Secretary Rumsfeld think then was going to keep law and order if it wasn't going to be a stabilisation
My
force?
view is he did not care.
How did he imagine that stability was going to arise out of
I don't think he cared about stability. He was intent, and give him his credit, on dismantling and destroying Al-Qaeda. I don't think he was intent at all on what the Afghanistan of the future would look like.
It was generally right not to put ourselves in the business of trying to govern a very foreign country for which we had neither the cultural nor the linguistic capacity to do it, and which would have dragged us into Afghan quarrels, and pretty soon we would be the problem. Not as an occupying power, but it's beyond our competence. On the other hand, I think we should have done more to build up the Afghan capability to provide for their own security.
force.
If there's one thing I would wish we had done, it was to use the time when things are relatively quiet.
Karzai had no militia of his own. His interim government, brokered by the UN, included warlords, the same people whose violence and corruption had given rise to the Taliban. While they occupied cabinet seats in Kabul, their militias filled the power vacuum outside.
People forget that he didn't create this administration. We did, with the international community, including the United Nations, including myself. We formed this government, and we told him, please come to Kabul and lead this group.
We allied ourselves with former warlords, and our objective was to destroy Al-Qaeda. And we very much then created and empowered a group of political actors not accountable, and also people who, as they grew in power, actually caused more instability.
In all this, the Taliban, who just months earlier had been the government of Afghanistan, seemed to have just vanished.
I was one of the people who was saying, look, where are the Taliban? These people controlled 90% of the country a few weeks ago.
And what was the response?
The response was, it's useless. You said, they have been defeated, it's gone, finished, they will never come back.
Within 6 months of the invasion, Britain and America began to avert their gaze from Afghanistan, preoccupied by another matter: preparations for the war in Iraq.
The biggest single mistake, just one, probably Iraq. We didn't know then. The most important player in Afghanistan, to the Americans, was absent-minded from day one, was looking somewhere else.
The world was now focused almost exclusively on Iraq, while Taliban gunmen started to cross the porous border into southern Afghanistan. It was March 2003, just 18 months after the invasion. The Taliban were back.
The Taliban went into Kandahar, and they were looking for targets. And, there were very few targets. I mean, there were just Afghans living there. There were no foreign troops there. There were a few Afghan government representatives who really weren't worth killing as far as the Taliban were concerned in those early days. So the Taliban just went further and further in to Afghanistan looking for targets.
The United Nations in Afghanistan has ordered its staff not to travel by road through the area where an international Red Cross worker was murdered last Thursday.
He was ordered out of his car by a group of armed men and then shot.
You had American generals sending off cables saying, you know, something is happening, sending cables even to Rumsfeld. And I think Rumsfeld ignored them. The White House ignored them.
We clearly have moved from major combat activity to a period of stability and stabilization and reconstruction and activities.
It was the forgotten war of 2002 to 2005. The Taliban were reorganizing. They were licking their wounds and figuring out what to do next. There wasn't a heavy British or coalition loss, and the country seemed to be relatively stable. It wasn't a war on the front pages.
And yet the Afghan war was far from over. In fact, it was about to reignite. By 2005, NATO was in control and did what Washington had so opposed at the start. They increased troop numbers and inched towards nation building. NATO wanted to extend the authority of the Afghan president Hamid Karzai beyond Kabul. Britain took on Helmand province.
It was suggested that I should go down to this place called Lashkargah. And everybody said, look, it's not entirely safe, but you'll be okay.
Boarding an old Russian helicopter, Britain's Foreign Office minister decided to take a look for himself at Lashkargah, capital of Helmand province.
And as we came into Lashkargah, I saw down below me this Beaugest fort. The commander was a guy called Colonel Hogberg. I said, what's it like here? And he said, well, sir, it ain't the end of the earth, but you can see it from here. He said, you could be wandering into a fight between two tribes or sub-tribes or villages over water rights. You could run into a drugs convoy. And he pointed out to me some of these drugs columns actually had anti-aircraft missiles on them. You could be running into Taliban or just a village that didn't like strangers. He said, we don't hang around because you never know who's shooting at you. I mean, this really struck me at the time as being an observation we ought to take a bit of notice of.
Helmand had little infrastructure, few public services, no functioning security, economy, or justice system. The Blair government's vision for Helmand, however, did not lack for ambition.
The original vision was that Karzai would be able to create a growing and sustainable peace, and that this would create a space in which governance would spread. And some people likened this to creating Belgium in a couple of years.
A team of experts was dispatched to Helmand by Whitehall in late 2005. Their task was to plan the delivery of this vision, with troops providing protection and expected home in just 3 years.
It was a task of biblical proportions. It was a medieval province, vast open spaces. There was no infrastructure. I remember flying across the province's only road. Corruption ran from top to bottom. So when one looked at all of this, one saw a rudderless expanse of not much, where the principal economy was drugs.
Some estimates said that 80% of the population were illiterate, and that extended to many key functions in government, including the director of education, who could not read or write.
We didn't know how many police stations there were, and the chief of police wasn't really sure either. There were sporadic outbursts of violence because of the drug trafficking. And when I asked the American officer what background research I should do to understand Helmand a little better, he said I should watch The Sopranos.
On their return home for Christmas, the planners met up with their Whitehall masters